Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Welcome to Autistic Stuff for Autistic People, a podcast in which a few autistic friends talk about their lived experiences and special interests. We are here to invite you into our world as autistic peers sharing relatable conversations about life as autistic people. Based on our experiences in creating peer support spaces online, we believe that introspective interpersonal connection is where some of the most lasting internal insights can come from. This podcast is for autistic people and anyone that lives with, works with, or loves an autistic person. I am Aradia, and I am the creatively autistic coach and a podcast producer for Fox and Raven Media.
Hi, I am Cheryl, and I am the Holistic Empowerment Coach, a 40-something Canadian who loves to work with other late-discovered autistic women and non-binary folk, as well as autistic spiritual abuse survivors.
And I'm Patrice, and I am the Autistic Presence Coach. I work with autistic women, and I also work with members of the Irish diaspora, and I am based in California.
And not joining us today is Matt, the actually autistic coach. He will be here another time. Welcome back to another episode of Autistic Stuff for Autistic People. Today, we are going to talk about functioning labels. What are they? What are they not? How they are misapplied? And if there are any redeeming qualities to using them. This episode's purpose falls into the lived experiences and autism information category and was suggested primarily by Cheryl, so I will turn it over to her to introduce in a little bit more detail. Why do we want to talk about this today, Cheryl?
Yeah, so this is a topic that has been coming up in my own life for a while now, as well as my clients. And there's been a couple big themes that I've noticed. One, when RFK recently was talking about how, autistic people would never be able to do certain things and was talking about a registry and figuring out the causes of autism by September. There was a lot flaring up on social media at that time amongst the autistic community, both actually autistic people as well as parents of autistic children. And there was a lot of important discussion going on. And what I was noticing was there was a lot of parents of people with autistic children with high support needs who rightfully so were really talking about the struggles they were going through, how they were in desperate need of funding and support by their governments, by their cities, by other institutions. And the purpose of this conversation today is not to negate in any way the experiences of families who are going through these really, really big challenges. There's a lot of spaces online If you're interested in learning more about families going through that, there's a lot of great people who have platforms who are talking about it. But for those of us who have been given a label, rightfully so, or definitely not rightfully so, of high functioning, which, just as a little aside, most of us in the autistic community, we really don't use it all that often because it hides a lot of the invisible challenges. It hides the fact that from one day to the next, my ability to function as expected in a neurotypical world is very different. And really, one of the big issues that I've noticed with clients is if they are seen as high functioning or if they are seen as low support needs, they don't feel that they're allowed to take up any space in this discussion of what do they actually need to live, a joyful life that is authentic to them. They often feel that they need to kind of keep themselves small and out of the discussion because, quote unquote, their experience isn't that bad, compared to others. And I kind of brought up this topic so that we could perhaps talk about functioning labels and, the potential harm that they can do and what they're hiding, and just bring this, conversation to a few different voices here.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's super relevant because terminology is kind of the basis of having a coherent conversation. If we're not using terms in a way that is like consistent across people, then like what are we even able to discuss? And yeah, these words are loaded and divisive and have a lot of different meanings for people, and especially with the RFK of it all. Yeah, we need to be conversant in what these terms mean and don't mean and what they're covering up. And I think this is a really, really important conversation. So I'm glad you brought it up, even though it is huge and undoubtedly we will not get to everything that needs to get gotten to.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl and Aradia. Yeah, I would just really like to share that with the topic of labels, what comes up for me is that already as autistics, especially if we're late discovered, we've struggled so much with trying to fit into a neurotypical world. And then if some of us are given the label high functioning or low needs, then we're kind of being told that we don't quite fit into what is a real autistic person in some ways. And I just really want to acknowledge the harm there that can be done in being told, well, you're not neurotypical, but you're also not at the same caliber as so many of these other autistic people, and just how othering that terminology can be.
Yeah, especially when that appearance of low support needs is coming at the high cost of masking and creeping burnout. Like, oh, you seem fine. It's like, but do you realize the budget I'm spending on quote unquote seeming fine? Like, if it doesn't cost you as much as it costs me to appear this way, are we really the same?
And I think this also links into something really important about even understanding our autism in the first place. If you look at the different criteria, it's so much of it is dependent on how it affects other people. It rarely looks at our lived experience, right? If you go to, a doctor for an official diagnosis, for example, most of the time they're looking at a set of criteria that shows up on the outside, how it affects other people, your ability to communicate with others, for example. The lived experience of autism is often overlooked. And that is the same thing that's happening sometimes with these functioning labels, right? When I first disclosed to a few friends that I am autistic, they immediately wanted to make me feel better. And so their first words out of their mouth were, "Oh, you must be high functioning." And that hierarchy is really dangerous. If you look at history, if you look at Asperger, if you look at what was happening during World War II, this idea that some autistic people have the right to live because we are quote unquote productive and able to contribute to society, where autistic children who were not were sent away to be killed. That idea of the hierarchy of functioning labels has left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths for obvious reasons. But the other thing about functioning labels is that they really don't reflect my actual needs, which fluctuate day to day. Like Aradia said, they also don't factor into account how much masking is required, how much pretending. You know, most of the time, if somebody is high functioning, and when I say high functioning, I mean given that label, it's because they have learned how to pass as neurotypical. It doesn't really have anything to do with the lived experience of, burnout or fatigue or feeling, that lack of authenticity. It has no bearing on like how much it takes to show up in any given day. And I think that's something that most people don't talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the root of why there's all this hysteria, for lack of a better word, about autism now, is because it's about the how productive can you be in our society and how disruptive are you going to be to the productive members of society. That is why these labels are quote unquote needed, is because then you can subdivide and categorize people and give them the appropriate slot in the great economic engine, right? If we don't see ourselves as primarily economic units, then how useful are these labels really, truly?
And how dangerous are these labels potentially when they're being used to say, oh, you're more valuable than another person who has more needs than you do. And yeah, as someone who has been a very highly masked, seemingly highly competent woman for most of my life up until hitting a burnout where I could no longer mask, I really actually disagree with kind of the sense that high functioning means lower needs. I believe that my needs were just more invisible to other people until they weren't. And at the end of the day, needs are needs, whether the need is for a wheelchair or an assisted talking device or more time to rest because I'm taking in so much sensory input. Needs are needs. And when we start ranking them, that's actually what happens in fascism when we say some people are better than others. It gets dark quickly, but I think it's really important to state that, just given what Cheryl's pointed out about the history during World War II and the categorizing of some autistics being worth saving, those who were the little professors of Asperger versus those who were sent to the camps. So, yeah, it's not light stuff. And I really just want to acknowledge the grief that's involved with not getting needs met and how these functioning labels and being categorized into one area versus another can really invite a lot more grief around being kind of told, okay, even in the autistic world, I'm going to invalidate your needs by giving you this label and implying that you don't have as many as someone who is more visibly autistic.
Thank you, Patrice, for mentioning that word invisible. I think that is something that really bears exploring, especially since for so many autistic people, we learned very early how much our needs affected other people. And for many of us, we made ourselves more invisible. We made ourselves smaller in order to avoid rocking the boat. I can't speak for everybody else, but I know I did. Just the idea of, oh my gosh, I need something right now. And that means that somebody else is going to maybe, be inconvenienced or something. It made me panic, right? This idea that maybe I would be rejected or abandoned for having needs. So having invisible needs or having, this label of low support, it doesn't mean that the actual needs are low. It could be the fact that we have made them smaller so that we don't inconvenience other people, right? And I think that is an important piece of this, right? They're not necessarily small, they're not necessarily low. We've just learned how to hide. We've learned how to mask. We've learned how to make ourselves invisible to avoid the bullying, to avoid, being targeted, to avoid being abandoned by people, that we need in our lives. And the other thing that I really want to add here, adding on to what you both have said, if these labels actually were leading to actual support and funding and help for all autistic people, then perhaps we could have a different conversation about labels, right? If knowing that this person that has a lot of high support needs had that label and was actually going to receive the help they needed, that might be a different conversation to have. But right now, there's not a lot of support anyways. So we have to really ask ourselves, what is the purpose of these functioning labels? If it's not leading to more support, what is the purpose? Is it to divide a community? Is it to invalidate our needs? Is it to make ourselves small and invisible? Is it to make ourselves pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and become more productive in a capitalist society? Like, we have to look at some of the inner workings of why we're told we need to be using some of these labels.
Yeah, I think that's so important because, yeah, it's like the not that bad narrative or like the oppression Olympics, right? Like, it's there's a double-edged sword of like you have to acknowledge that people have let me see, what's the word, a spectrum of experiences. People have different experiences, and it can be helpful to navigate, label, map those differences. And yet it is so easy to slip into not just playing the oppression Olympics like in a capitalist sense, but also in the invalidating your own needs sense. And like one of the other things that I find really frustrating about the labels conversation is how it's like, oh, well, your low support needs, high functioning, whatever today, which clearly means you're going to be like that tomorrow and next week. And it's like, no, I personally just did a weekend event where I really needed to be super social. Like I was one of the central figures of the event. So I really needed to like put on my costume and like make sure that I was like socializing with everyone and thanking them for showing up. Like that was the role I needed to play. And, accepting that this whole week I'm going to be much lower energy for all of my socializing. All my regular social stuff is going to be at a lower point than it normally would be, just because I know I spent that energy this weekend. And it's like, if I look at myself as, oh, well, I'm just high functioning, I'm just a little autistic, I just have a touch of the tism, then I can just, power on through that. And it's like, no, I am a completely autistic person, wholly autistic. I'm going to have some very high support needs when it comes to feeding and cleaning myself this week. Like those support needs are going to spike temporarily. And that doesn't mean anything radical about my future or my past. It just means that I have variable abilities. But if someone needs me to perform last week like I did, or needs me to perform next week like I did last week, that's going to be a trickier. I'm going to have to mask for that rather than just saying, "Ooh, I'm going to need to eat cereal this week because I don't have the executive function to cook hot food."
Yeah, there's definitely a constant rationing of energy for me. In a way, I kind of feel like I'm always running a marathon without actually running, but I'm always thinking how many miles are left in the day or the week and how much energy do I feel like I have and do I have enough water, like the goo stuff you have on you grab when you're running. It's a constant accounting going on inside me. And sometimes it's something I have to pay attention to all day long. And maybe other times where there aren't as many external demands, I can kind of cruise a little bit more, where I'm not thinking about where's my next shot of water, when can I slow down? And it's not consistent. And that is part of autism. That's why we seek consistency through our routines, because our internal experience can be so volatile.
Yeah. And I think part of this, and this conversation will not be a surprise to anybody who is actually autistic. But if you're listening and, you're friends with an autistic person, or, you love somebody who's autistic, or you work with somebody who's autistic, sometimes just hearing the word autism, it doesn't really encapsulate the full spectrum of experiences. And, like what you were saying about rationing energy, that's a huge part of it, right? We can go to the grocery store and hear literally every single sound, take in every single event and conversation and the textures and the lights. And by the end of that hour, you can be completely depleted for the rest of the day or more. And so, you take into account sensory differences, you take into account, information processing differences, processing more information at any given time. You take into account, social and communication differences. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg that autistic people are constantly navigating. And, a lot of times people will say something like, well, you're not like my, I've got a niece or nephew who's autistic, and you're not like them. They're 5. And, part of this is, digging past the stereotypes, right? We've seen stereotypes in the media, and there's a certain expectation of how autistic people are supposed to act. But an autistic child and an autistic adult are two very different experiences, because one is a child and one is an adult. One has a lot of lived experiences under their belt. And it doesn't make one better or worse or easier or more difficult. It's just different. So I may be feeling the exact same thing that your autistic child is feeling. I may be ready to have an absolute meltdown on the floor, but perhaps because of societal expectations and masking and, people expecting me to be, higher functioning, perhaps I wait and I have my meltdown outside of your view. So again, going back to what Patrice, you were saying, but of invisibility, right? Our experiences are not the same. And I think sometimes that muddies the conversation as well, right? The stereotypes and the expectations of, children versus adults.
And I think it's worth noting too, I know I've noted this before, but the 3 of us, we were all socialized as female, I believe. And that comes with kind of strict orders to be a good girl. And that means you don't have meltdowns that people see. You don't have needs. You're conditioned to serve others and to be nice and accommodating. And I can think of so many times in my childhood where if I did have something that was likely an expression of high sensitivity or having a meltdown, I was told I was being too sensitive. I was told or worse. And so I did learn to have one self that I showed to others, and then spend a lot of time by myself where I could then basically collapse and feel the feelings I couldn't show to anyone else. So yeah, if you're comparing me to a little boy who's having very externalized meltdowns, yes, I really don't look like that boy. And even when I was a child, I probably didn't either, because we socialize boys and girls differently in this society. That's what happens in patriarchy.
And yet the needs might have been exactly the same.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Despite the external labels of functioning or, behavior.
Despite what the world sees, the needs are the same. Yeah.
And to add on to that really quickly, and I know we've mentioned this before, but I do think it bears repeating, we are all white.
That's right.
And so that's another way of this, these labels getting so distorted and actually weaponized, right, against, Black and brown people, Indigenous people who don't have the same level of privilege, who cannot afford to have a meltdown in public because it would be of great danger to them in a lot of our cities. So there's so much happening beneath the surface with misogyny and capitalism and racism that these labels of functioning, they're just so surface, and we're totally missing what's going on underneath.
Yeah, I think that's like one of the most important things about all of this is like these labels apply to the external experience of others, right? And if you actually dig down into people's lived experiences and you have them start talking about, this is my sensory experience, this is my struggles with food, then a lot of the socialization as various genders and socioeconomic statuses, like they start to fall away, and we start to really just vibe on like, yeah, here's my fix for dealing with getting a horrible squicky sensation. And here's how I can correct it. Maybe that helps you. Even though we have different squicky sensations, we both know what the squick feels like. That's not something that's apparent externally. That's not something that any systematic pathologizing overview is going to capture. And yet when we all get together and start talking, that rises to the surface very quickly. And maybe even within our own communities, we can start to be like, oh, you have middling tolerance for squicky sensations. You have zero tolerance for squicky sensations. Maybe we come up with our own labeling system that allows us to be like, oh, you have the capacity to take this on. Maybe you go to the front of the line for dealing with the horrible sensations. Because some people, like me and my mom, me and my husband, we have a dynamic duo of like, I can handle this better than you. We know that. We have our own internal language for describing, no, that's a bad one for you. Give it to me. I'll take it. But again, that's not something that the government can impose by doing a survey that wraps up by September.
Exactly. And it also, Aradia, you're touching on something really, really important in terms of the understanding of the spectrum itself, right? When we hear about this in the media, we often get this view of like, it's a straight line, right? So if you're at one end, you are high functioning, low needs, and if you're at the other end, you're low functioning, high needs.
Yeah, bland through spicy.
Yeah, that is not really what the spectrum means. Or even at its worst, well, we're all a little autistic, so we all fall in there somewhere. No, autistic traits are human traits, but you are autistic if those traits impact your life in a significant way. And so the analogy that I saw once online that I loved so much was more about viewing it more like, a stovetop. So you have like different burners and you have different like levels to those burners, right? So my sensory might be all the way up to a 10, right? Another autistic person, maybe theirs is only at a 7, but you know what? They really have a hard time in, social situations. And we have all sorts of attributes that go along with being autistic, not just the challenges, not just the needs, but also the strengths, the joys, the heightened emotion of living in this world that we sometimes experience as autistic people that can actually be beautiful. The depth that we feel, the depth that we understand, the way we can connect with people, especially other neurodivergent people, like those need to be acknowledged and celebrated as well. But it all falls on the spectrum more about like the dial levels instead of this straight line idea. So I think that bears, highlighting too, because for some reason people hear the word spectrum and it's just they kind of want to plot you on this straight line, this axis. That's not it. Because even within the same person, that dial could be up or down on any given day, right? When I'm on my period, my sensory is at a 15, let alone a 10, right? It's heightened. You touch my arm, it hurts, right? The dog barks, it feels like I'm being stabbed in the eardrum. Like it's an internal lived experience. I loved what you said about the labels applied to the external experiences of others. It doesn't touch on what we're experiencing every single day inside.
Yeah, it really seems that the functioning labels, they can reflect a person's ability to mask or cope with the different marginalizations that they're facing rather than a true representation of their needs. And it seems to me that the more marginalized you are, the more pressure on you to deny your needs in order to fit in with society, or with neurotypical society, I should say. I think often about that statistic that autistics take in 142% of what neurotypicals take in terms of input information. And if we started there as a society and could come to some kind of acceptance and kind of like peak understanding that that's what autistics are facing, then it seems that that would be a more compassionate way to look at all these people, no matter how their needs are expressed, no matter what you see on the outside. These people are taking in so much more. So of course, wouldn't it make sense that they need more downtime? They might need a little bit softer of an experience in work or at the grocery store or in a conversation. Yeah, just a thought there.
Yeah. I think it's worth returning to how much this debate is splintering the larger community too, because here's the three of us, we've got our rapport, we've got our little pocket, we've got, our way of looking at the world. But this conversation was not inspired by us enjoying the concept of functioning labels. This was inspired by the fact that functioning labels are an extremely divisive thing that's kind of cutting through the larger community right now. I mean, it has been since the dawn of forever, but it's extra spicy right now for reasons that we're all aware of. And I think it's really worth digging into why is this so divisive? It's because we're chasing after scraps of resources, of support, of acceptance, right? Like this is saying, I'm not like those other nasty disabled people. I deserve safety. And that's like, it's worth interrogating that and being like, we all deserve safety and support because we're, humans. How can we take this conversation and turn it around as a larger society? How can we yes and this into a less eugenical direction? Or can we? Is that too much of an ask?
I mean, I think the first level is what we're doing right now. We're exploring our experiences with functioning labels. We're talking about why they get used and why they get thrown around at other people. And I mean, you gave a really good example of the splinter within the current like online discourse within the autistic community. I'm not as disabled as you, or conversely, I am more disabled than you. Therefore, I do deserve the support that's available, right? And so much of this does tie back into, like capitalist systems. But I don't know, just this idea of, I think before we even move on to the solution, just kind of looking at the marginalized piece again real quick. I actually just finished a workshop. We were looking at how to become like more flourishing while we're marginalized. And it was great because it was a mix of people who had various levels of marginalization, right? Being a woman is one level, being autistic is one level, but being a person of color is another level. Being an immigrant is another level. Having visible disabilities is another level, right? So going back to this idea of, functioning labels within different communities and different, levels of marginalization, right? Even with masking and unmasking, like there's so many systems, the healthcare system, trying to navigate that. If you're trying to get citizenship, if you're trying to get housing, if you're trying to get a job, right? We have all these, systems and obstacles in place that maybe are influencing people to, embrace some of these functioning labels just so they can navigate a system that is really stacked against them, right? So, I mean, to answer your question of like, where do we go from here? There's multi-pronged approach here, right? One of them is looking at the systems itself that are keeping us either completely burnt out, exhausted, masking, or needing to prove our disability for very small scraps, as well as understanding the functioning labels themselves. And then the other piece is, how do we open up this conversation to the autistic community as a whole, but also our allies, right? How do we bring in some allied support here? Other groups have talked about the concept of allies for a while, but how many of us have, I'm very lucky. I do have a couple of very strong allies, but like the people in our own lives understanding the harm of functioning labels, right? Can we educate in a very small way, like our own circle of influence, right? I mean, we're lucky because we have this podcast and we can talk about it. And, not everybody's going to agree with us. And that is completely okay. If you're listening right now and you're like, you know what, I have a lot of support needs and, identifying as high or low functioning helps me, then, I'm not here to tell you what to do or what to believe. But, this discussion I think is still really, really important because of a lot of the hidden damage and danger that can go along with it. So I don't have a solution. I don't know where to go from here.
I know, it's a big question, but language is hard, and we have to use the tools we have to build whatever it is that's coming next.
But can we go just kind of expand off of what Patrice was saying earlier? If let's say we didn't, let's go to a different world right now. Let's say we didn't have functioning labels and we just said, I need help. I have needs. I need support. Like, is that enough? Or is there more needed, right? Like I'm thinking of some people who are experiencing, perhaps they have somebody in their life, an autistic person who is autistic but also has intellectual challenges, like developmental delays, right? They may have more than one thing going on and they really do desperately need help and support, right? How do we convey that without value judgments and prioritizing and, proving deficits, et cetera, et cetera? How do we get how do we open up this discussion so that people understand that autism is in fact a disability in need of support and understanding and education for themselves, not for us, but for them?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because for most of my growing up, I knew my mom was autistic, but I didn't admit that I was autistic. But I did do things like wear ridiculous bug eye sunglasses because the sun was too bright. And I never really felt the need to explain my terrible fashion choice. I was just like, these are the sunglasses that I can wear. I didn't get my driver's license because it was just too overwhelming to I failed the test once and every time my parents corrected me, I had a huge RSD flare up, which we will get to in a subsequent episode. Every time I got corrected in the car, it was instant meltdown. So I was just like, I guess I'm not driving. I guess I'm never getting my driver's license because it's safer for everyone if I don't. And that was just the pitch I gave to people, was like, you don't drive? I'm like, trust me, you don't want me to drive. It's much safer for everyone. And I never said that it had to do with support needs or whatever. That might have been faster, but I did live in a space where for me, I was able to just say, this is how I exist. And people did not give me too much of an issue with that. But also, if I had had maybe a slightly more systematized, community-based sense of what support needs were, maybe I wouldn't have masked quite as hard as I did. Learning that I'm autistic now, I'm finding so many things that I used to push through that I don't push through. Right? I used to be like, oh, I have my sunglasses. Now I'm starting to be like, I have my sunglasses and my hat, and I need to be in the shade, or else I'm going inside and I'm not apologizing for it. So it's like having a common language is so helpful. But yeah, it is also, I mean, especially for people who are in that like, am I autistic, am I not, high functioning category space debate, like, are you just taking a little bit of agency for yourself already with having like unstylish sunglasses? Embrace that as confirmation that you do in fact have needs and you are meeting them. You maybe just don't have a pathologizing system to put that need into. But you might be taking care of your needs just without a shared lexicon.
Yeah, for me, it's been really important in my acceptance of my needs to acknowledge the grief that's there and to feel the grief and, to really be with those parts of myself that are grieving and feel scared. There are parts of me that have felt scared to have a disability and scared to have needs and scared to not be able to hide them anymore. And as I've spent time with that grief, I'll do it on walks in nature. I have a neurodivergent affirming therapist. I have a coach. I do it in autistic peer support places. Over time, that grief becomes more embodied and I'm not flooded by it. And I'm becoming more comfortable in a really just matter-of-fact way, naming it sometimes when I sense that there's some safety, like, hey, I know you might not be able to get this because it's happening inside me, but I really need the lights dimmed right now because I'm autistic. I'm just saying that's an example. It's not a prescription for anyone to do and not necessarily everything I say all at once, but I'm just noticing as I embody my reality, I'm more able to advocate from a place of calm and feeling okay whether that person dismisses my needs or not, because I'm showing up for me. And I know that if I'm not getting my need met there, that at least I've got me.
That's huge. I'm really glad you mentioned that grief piece, Patrice, because that's a huge part of, at least for my journey of unmasking and getting my needs met in a healthier way, is working through the grief of not being able to do things, right? I was told my whole life, oh, you can do anything you put your mind to. And I actually can't, right? Not even counting the ADHD piece, but I have limitations. And, in this world of everything needs to happen quickly and, all I have to do is just think happy thoughts and everything's great. Like, those are not, that's not accurate, right? I have limitations. And accepting them has been hard. Accepting that I am disabled is hard. Using that language to describe myself has been tough. But it's also been a really powerful journey to kind of acknowledge how much is expected of us as, cogs in the machine of capitalism, and saying, I am not a machine. I am not able to do what you're expecting of me right now. And yes, while there is some level of privilege in being able to acknowledge and meet my own needs now after much trial and error, I fully recognize that there are some people who have support needs to the point where they can't really meet their own needs and they need other people to help them with that, right? But this discussion is still really important. The grief around it and our ability to acknowledge what we need.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was just thinking like, it's almost like like we've ranked them because it's levels 1, 2, and 3, right? It's like they're Olympic medals, like they're prizes. They're ranked in a hierarchy. And that's really what's hurting us, I think. Having labels like maybe if it was, I don't know, A, B, and C, apple, orange, banana, like some sort of like non-hierarchical labeling system, it might be easier to just be like, oh, I'm the kind of person that needs a wheelchair. I'm the kind of person that needs a cane. And it's not greater or lesser, it's just different. Like that could be really helpful because yeah, not all of us need 24/7 care and some of us do. Like it's worth being able to describe that without a paragraph. It's worth having a category for that, but not if it's going to be, oh, you got out of level 3, you lucky dog, you're up into level 2. Maybe you'll achieve level 1 someday. Like that's not what we're going for.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good visual. That's a really good visual. Like, having like more neutral language around it, right? Like, oh,
Yes.
you're the type of person that can work 30 hours a week. I can only work 15. Or, you know what? I can't work at all. And that could change, but it has no bearing on my value whatsoever. Like, getting back to this idea of describing our experience without the value judgment of the label. Again, that might be just a lofty dream, and again, and I know I feel like I'm repeating myself because I do know how important it is that, some people cannot advocate for themselves and they cannot get their own needs met. So we need to find ways around their caregivers being able to access better support and to be able to join in these conversations, right? I don't want to center just the lived experience of people like us, while at the same time, I don't want to center another group to the exclusion of the rest of us either. Like there has to be a way to include people to the table without like build a bigger table instead of just, making the pie smaller. Like can we have a bigger pie? Can we have a bigger table and bring more people in, speaking people, non-speaking people, people who, use assistive communicative devices, who need, wheelchairs, canes, like you were saying. There's got to be a way to talk about it without like the shame and the guilt or the grief and all those heavy emotions.
Yeah. Even to the point of our government needs to be able to speak in this language because the government is going to be part of systems. We can't get away from that.
This might just be part one.
What's striking me from this conversation is that it's clear to me that everyone may have different needs, but everyone's needs are equally valid.
I like that. I like that.
That part, we have very different needs and all have an equal need to get those needs met.
That's right.
And having needs does not make you less of a human being.
Having needs makes you a human being.
Actually, yeah. Do we have any other thoughts before I take us out of the episode?
I think maybe just to say that this is a worthwhile engagement. It can feel really scary and hard and challenging to confront not having needs met. And I really respect anyone who's willing to engage with how painful this discussion can be, but also when we engage with these issues, when we have these conversations, that is how we can come to a place of seeing what the next steps are and creating pathways that can improve our own lives, but also then model how others can help to improve their lives and in so doing help the whole autistic community.
I could probably say a million more things, but I do feel like just me going within in these last few months, especially around, functioning labels and just kind of looking at my own motivations for, the use of these labels in the past and just kind of doing the research into, why we use them and why they might be helpful or really unhelpful. It's just part of my own journey. And like Patrice said, I respect anybody who's on that journey as well. And whatever you find, just adding more to the conversation, and we can learn from each other.
And there we have it. A friendly and very autistic discussion around functioning labels, which strayed into external versus internal experiences of autism, fluctuating needs, the history of categorizing autistic people from the past into the present. And it really helped me further appreciate just how sad and scary it is to admit what our disabilities really mean for us across time and conditions and ages. We did not solve the problem of how to fix functioning labels, but hopefully we helped you think about the issues in the words and labels that we all use to describe our experiences. When we return in 2 weeks, we will be covering something from one of the other 3 pillars of this show. It might be more lived experiences via rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or it might be something else. But regardless, it will be interesting. As a reminder, we are all peer support coaches within the Autistic Peer Support Coaching Collective, offering a variety of free and paid intentionally autistic spaces. You can learn more and follow us at our website, autisticcoaches.com. You can support us by sharing the podcast with your friends, peers, and anyone who lives with, works with, or loves an autistic person. We are going to get a Ko-fi set up soon where you can support us with money, but truly your best way to help us is to share the podcast. Thank you for listening to us talking about autistic stuff for autistic people. We may at some point have a place for your comments to keep the conversation going, probably on Blue Sky or Substack or email, I don't know. Stay tuned for that. Until next time, go find a consenting furry creature, or feathered creature, or scaled creature, and give it some love. Autistic Stuff for Autistic People is a production of Fox and Draven Media. For more podcasts from Fox and Draven Media, visit our website, foxanddravenmedia.com.